The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium with the finality of thunder, and every conversation in the Prescott Valley auction house died instantly. In the center ring stood a horse that seemed carved from nightmares. 16 hands of pure black, muscle, with eyes that held the fury of 1,000 storms. Steam rose from his flanks in the cool morning air, and his hooves struck the ground like hammers on anvils. "Gentlemen," called Augustus Fairweather, his diamond-encrusted watch catching the arena lights, "I present Inferno's Shadow, the most magnificent and dangerous animal ever to grace these grounds." The millionaire's voice carried across the hushed crowd like silk over steel. "This stallion has hospitalized 12 professional riders, ended 3 careers, and sent champions running for the gates." Beside him, oil tycoon Cornelius Blackthorne adjusted his Italian suit and smiled coldly. $20 million to whoever can ride him for 8 seconds. But here's the catch. His voice rose dramatically. "It's impossible. We've brought the best riders money can buy. Olympic champions, rodeo legends, horse whisperers from across the globe. They all failed." The crowd murmured as memories surfaced. Last month, Rafael the Hurricane Mendoza, 3-time world champion, had lasted exactly 4 seconds before Inferno's Shadow launched him into the arena wall, shattering his collarbone. 2 weeks ago, Montana's legendary bronc rider Dutch Sullivan walked away after one look at the stallion, claiming he'd rather wrestle a grizzly bear. In the back corner of the arena, pressed against the weathered wooden bleachers, stood Maverick Mav Calhoun. At 23, he was lean as a whip and twice as tough, with calloused hands that told stories of countless hours in the saddle. His grandfather's worn Stetson sat atop sandy hair that hadn't seen a proper barber in months, and his jeans bore the honest dirt of a man who earned his living with sweat and grit. Mav's pale blue eyes never left the stallion as Fairweather continued his showboat performance. "You see, my friends, some forces of nature simply cannot be conquered. This magnificent beast represents the last untamable spirit in our domesticated world. We've offered our fortune, not because we believe someone will succeed, but to prove that true wildness still exists." The horse reared suddenly, his front hooves cutting through the air like scythes. The handler holding his lead rope stumbled backward, fear written across his weathered face. Several spectators gasped and stepped away from the ring's edge, but Mav stepped forward. He'd been broke for 3 months now, sleeping in his beat-up Ford pickup and living on gas station coffee and determination. His last job at the Riverside ranch had ended when the owner sold to developers, and every other spread in the county had already filled their positions for the season. The $20 million wasn't what drew him. It was the look in that stallion's eyes, a look he recognized from staring into his own reflection during the darkest nights. "That horse ain't mean," Mav whispered to himself, his drawl thick as honey. "He's just tired of being misunderstood." As Fairweather gestured grandly toward the exit, inviting the crowd to witness what he called the final proof of mankind's limitations, Mav pushed through the dispersing audience. His boots echoed against the concrete floor, each step carrying him closer to a destiny that would shake the foundations of everything these wealthy men believed about power, money, and the human spirit. The stallion's ears flicked forward as Mav approached, and for just a moment those wild eyes seemed to hold something other than rage. They held recognition. "Excuse me, sir." Mav's voice cut through the arena's settling dust like a blade through silk. Fairweather turned, his expression shifting from theatrical triumph to mild annoyance as he took in the young cowboy's threadbare appearance. "The auction house is closing, son. Perhaps you should—" "I'd like to try." Mav's words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in the street at high noon. Blackthorne let out a bark of laughter that echoed off the arena walls. "Boy, do you have any idea what you're looking at? This animal has broken bones that will never heal properly. He's sent men to the emergency room who've been riding since before you were born." Mav's eyes never wavered from the stallion, who had gone statue still at the sound of his voice. "I reckon I know what I'm looking at better than most folks here." The handful of remaining spectators began to gather again, drawn by the sudden tension crackling through the air. Fairweather studied Mav with the calculating gaze of a man who'd built his fortune on reading people. "What's your name, cowboy?" Maverick Calhoun, sir. Friends call me Mav. Well, Mav, Fairweather's tone dripped with condescension. I admire your spirit, but I'm afraid spirit alone won't keep you from the hospital. This isn't some county fair bronc ride. This is a demon with 4 legs and a death wish. But Mavi was already moving toward the ring's edge, his movements fluid and confident. The stallion tracked his approach, nostrils flaring as he caught the young man's scent. Instead of the usual aggressive posturing, Inferno's shadow simply watched, his massive head tilted slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle. Stop right there, Blackthorn commanded, his voice sharp with authority. I won't have some homeless drifter's death on my conscience. Security. 2 thick-set men in polo shirts began moving toward Mav, but he'd already slipped through the gate's opening. The handler holding Inferno's shadow's lead rope looked frantically between the approaching cowboy and the Millionaires, clearly unsure of his orders. Easy, boy, Mav whispered, his voice carrying the rhythm of wind through prairie grass. I ain't here to hurt you. The stallion's ears pricked forward, and something miraculous happened. The tension in his massive frame began to ease. His pawing stopped, and the wild rolling of his eyes settled into focused attention. Fairweather felt a cold finger of unease trace down his spine. In all the months since acquiring this animal, he'd never seen such a response. Mav, I'm warning. You gentlemen made an offer, Mav called over his shoulder, never taking his eyes off the horse. 20 million for 8 seconds, I'm here to collect. Blackthorn's face reddened with indignation. You little fool. We made that offer to professionals, not to some cowpoke who can't afford a decent meal. Look at yourself. When's the last time you had a real job? Mav's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Last job was at the Riverside Ranch before they sold to developers. Before that, worked the Morrison spread for 3 years. Before that, learned everything I know from my grandfather, who could gentle a horse with nothing but patience and respect. Respect? Fairweather scoffed. That animal doesn't understand respect. He only understands fear and pain. Slowly, deliberately, Mav extended his hand toward Inferno's shadow's muzzle. The crowd held its collective breath. The stallion leaned forward, his massive head moving with surprising gentleness, and touched his nose to Mav's palm. The handler's mouth fell open. I'll be damned. Indeed you will, Blackthorn muttered, his confidence beginning to crack like ice in spring. This is some sort of trick. The horse is sedated or... His words died as Inferno's shadow lowered his great head and pressed his forehead against Mav's chest, a gesture of trust that none of the wealthy men had ever witnessed. Sometimes, Mav said quietly, his hand moving to stroke the stallion's neck, the wildest spirits just need someone who speaks their language. The silence in the arena was deafening, broken only by the soft whisper of Mav's hand moving across Inferno's shadow's neck. Word had spread like wildfire through the parking lot, and people were streaming back into the building. Local news crews, somehow alerted to the developing story, were setting up cameras along the bleachers. Fairweather's composure cracked completely. This is impossible. That horse has been evaluated by the finest animal behaviorists in the country. Dr. Patricia Westmont from the University of Colorado called him fundamentally unrideable. She has 30 years of experience, Mav continued his gentle ministrations, working his way along the stallion's powerful shoulder. Inferno's shadow's breathing had deepened, and the wild fire in his eyes had transformed into something approaching contentment. Maybe your experts were looking at the wrong thing, Mav said without turning around. See, most folks try to break a horse's spirit to make him rideable, but this boy's spirit ain't meant to be broken. It's meant to be partnered with. Blackthorn pulled out his phone, frantically typing messages. I'm calling this off. There has to be some liability issue. Some insurance problem. Now hold on, came a voice from the crowd. Judge Harrison Whitmore, the county's most respected arbitrator, pushed through the gathering spectators. His presence commanded immediate attention. I heard about your wager, gentlemen. Are you planning to honor it? Fairweather's face flushed. Crimson. Judge Whitmore, surely you can see that this is highly irregular. We never intended for some vagrant to— Your words were broadcast on 3 radio stations this morning, the judge interrupted, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. You offered $20 million to anyone who could ride that stallion for 8 seconds. I don't recall hearing any qualifications about professional status or financial standing. The crowd murmured its agreement. Cell phone cameras captured every moment as Mav slowly walked around Inferno's shadow, the massive horse turning to keep him in sight, like a flower following the sun. This is madness, Blackthorn hissed to his partner. Do you know what $20 million means to our quarterly projections? But Fairweather was watching something that chilled him to the bone. The handler was offering Mav the lead rope, and the young cowboy was shaking his head. Instead, Mav was working with just his voice and hands, and the stallion was responding like a beloved pet. All right, boy, Mav whispered, moving to Inferno's shadow's left side. You and me are gonna show these folks what real partnership looks like. The arena fell silent as Mav placed his left hand on the stallion's withers and his right hand on the powerful back. Inferno's shadow turned his head to watch, but showed none of the aggressive tension that had characterized his every interaction with previous riders. Wait, Fairweather's voice cracked with desperation. There's no saddle. He can't ride bareback. That's suicide. Mav paused, looking back with a slight smile. Mister, I've been riding bareback since I was 12 years old. My grandfather always said if you need a saddle to stay on a horse, you don't really know how to ride. With fluid grace born of countless hours in the saddle, Mav swung himself onto Inferno's shadow's back. The crowd gasped, waiting for the explosion of bucking and violence that had marked every previous attempt. It never came. Instead, Inferno's shadow stood perfectly still, his ears pricked forward as if listening to some unheard music. Mav settled into position, his legs finding their natural place against the stallion's sides, his hands resting lightly on the powerful neck. 8 seconds starts now, Judge Whitmore announced, raising his stopwatch. Slowly, as if moving through, honey, Inferno's shadow began to walk forward. Not the wild, frantic bucking that had terrorized professional riders, but a smooth, collected gait that showcased his natural grace and power. The crowd watched in stunned silence as horse and rider moved as one entity, Mav's body flowing with every step, his face serene and confident. The stallion's head was high and proud, his movements controlled and purposeful. 3 seconds, the judge called out. Fairweather and Blackthorn stood frozen, watching their fortune disappear with each tick of the clock. 5 seconds. Mav leaned forward slightly, whispering something in Inferno's shadow's ear. The stallion's ears flicked back to catch every word. 7 seconds. Time seemed suspended, the entire arena holding its breath. 8 seconds. Judge Whitmore's voice boomed across the arena. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a winner. The explosion of cheers was deafening, but Mav remained on Inferno's shadow's back, both of them basking in their shared triumph. The aftermath was chaos. Reporters surged forward with microphones and cameras, shouting questions over the crowd's jubilant roar. Fairweather and Blackthorn stood in stunned silence, their faces ashen as the reality of their situation sank in. $20 million, Blackthorn whispered, his voice barely audible above the celebration. We don't have 20 million in liquid assets. Fairweather's hands trembled as he watched Mav slide gracefully from Inferno's shadow's back, the stallion nuzzling his shoulder with obvious affection. This was supposed to be impossible. Every expert, every analysis, every scientific evaluation said it couldn't be done. Judge Whitmore approached the 2 millionaires with his characteristic no-nonsense demeanor. Gentlemen, I believe you have a debt to settle. Now wait just a minute, Blackthorn blustered, his face reddening. There have to be legal technicalities here. The wager wasn't properly witnessed or documented or— Actually, Judge Whitmore interrupted, pulling out his own phone. The entire event was live-streamed on the arena's social media account. We have approximately 15,000 witnesses, and counting. The terms were clearly stated and publicly acknowledged. Dr. Patricia Westmont, the animal behaviorist Fairweather had mentioned earlier, pushed through the crowd. Her silver hair was disheveled, and her scientific composure completely shattered. "I need to examine that horse immediately. What we just witnessed defies every principle of equine psychology I've studied for 3 decades. Mav overheard and turned toward her, still keeping one hand on Inferno's Shadow's neck. "Ma'am, with all due respect, maybe the problem wasn't with the horse. Maybe it was with the approach." Dr. Westmont's eyebrows shot up. "Young man, do you have any idea who I am? I've published 17 papers on aggressive equine behavior patterns." "No, ma'am, I don't know who you are," Mav replied respectfully, "but I know who he is." He gestured toward Inferno's Shadow. "He's a horse that's been treated like a problem to be solved instead of a partner to be understood." Meanwhile, Fairweather was frantically making phone calls, trying to find a way out of the financial catastrophe. "Marcus, I need you to find me a loophole. $20 million. My entire art collection isn't worth that much." The crowd began to part as a new figure entered the arena. Cordelia Ashworth, the renowned auction house owner and one of the most powerful women in the equestrian world, strode forward with purpose. Her silver-tipped cane clicked against the concrete with each measured step. "Augustus Cornelius," she said with icy politeness, "I believe congratulations are in order. You've just witnessed the most expensive 8 seconds in auction house history." Blackthorn whirled on her. "Cordelia, surely you understand this was never meant to be a real wager. It was a publicity stunt, a demonstration of your arrogance," she finished coldly. "I've been watching this travesty unfold. For months, you turned a magnificent animal into a sideshow attraction to stroke your own egos." She turned to Mav, who was still standing quietly beside Inferno's Shadow. "Young man, what's your name?" "Maverick Calhoun, ma'am." "Well, Mr. Calhoun, it appears you're about to become a very wealthy young man. The question is, what do you intend to do with your prize?" Mav looked at Inferno's Shadow, who returned his gaze with what could only be described as trust. "Well, ma'am, first thing I'd like to do is buy this horse from these gentlemen. Seems to me he's been in the wrong hands for too long." Fairweather's face went pale. "You can't be serious. That animal is worth at least $2 million on his own." "Then I'll pay you $2 million for him," Mav said simply. "Out of my winnings." The crowd erupted in applause at this unexpected twist. Cordelia Ashworth smiled for the first time since entering the arena. "Mr. Calhoun," she said, "I own the largest horse training facility in 3 states. If you're interested, I'd like to offer you a position as my head trainer. With your own methods, your own program, and complete autonomy over how you work with the animals." Mav's eyes widened. It was more than he'd ever dared dream. Not just the money, but the chance to work with horses the way he believed they should be treated. Dr. Westmont stepped forward again, her earlier hostility replaced by genuine curiosity. "Mr. Calhoun, would you be willing to let me document your methods? What you've accomplished here could revolutionize our understanding of human-horse relationships." As the offers and opportunities swirled around him, Mav felt Inferno's Shadow nudge his shoulder. The stallion's message was clear. Don't forget what's really important. 3 months later, the Ashworth Equestrian Center buzzed with unprecedented activity. What had once been an elite training facility for wealthy clients had transformed into something entirely different under Mav's guidance. A revolutionary approach to horse training that was drawing attention from around the world. Mav stood in the center of the main arena, working with a young mare named Wistba, who had been deemed untrainable by 3 previous facilities. Like Inferno's Shadow before her, she bore the scars of harsh treatment and broken trust. Unlike the old methods that focused on dominance and control, Mav's approach centered on communication and mutual respect. "Easy, girl," he murmured, standing perfectly still as the nervous mare circled him at a distance. "Nobody's gonna force you to do anything. We've got all the time in the world." In the observation area above, Dr. Westmont frantically scribbled notes while a documentary crew from National Geographic captured every moment. What they were witnessing challenged decades of established equine training theory. Day 87. Dr. Westman spoke into her recorder. Subject continues to respond to Calhoun's non-coercive methods. The mare, previously classified as dangerously unpredictable, is showing signs of voluntary engagement that shouldn't be possible according to current behavioral models. Cordelia Ashworth watched from her office window, a satisfied smile playing across her lips. The facility's reputation had skyrocketed since Mav's arrival. They had a 2-year waiting list of horses that other trainers had given up on, and equestrian professionals from 6 countries had applied for apprenticeships under Mav's revolutionary program. But the real transformation was in the horses themselves. The facility now housed 12 animals that had been written off as impossible cases. Under Mav's patient guidance, each one was slowly rediscovering their trust in humans. Inferno's shadow had become the star pupil and Mav's constant companion. The magnificent stallion now spent his days helping Mav work with traumatized horses, somehow communicating to them that safety and respect were possible again. "Mav," called Cordelia as she entered the arena. "There's someone here to see you." Young girl, perhaps 10 years old, stood beside her grandmother in the arena's entrance. The child's eyes were wide with a mixture of hope and fear that Mav recognized immediately. "This is Autumn Sinclair," Cordelia explained. "She was in a riding accident 6 months ago. The doctors say she's physically healed, but she hasn't been able to go near a horse since." Mav approached slowly, crouching down to the girl's eye level. "Hey there, Autumn. I'm Mav. What brings you to our place?" "Grandma says you can fix scared horses," the girl whispered. "I was wondering, can you fix scared people too?" Something in her voice reminded Mav of every broken-spirited animal he'd ever worked with. "Well, I don't know about fixing anybody," he said gently. "But I do know something about helping folks remember that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and choosing to try anyway." He stood and gestured toward Inferno's shadow, who was approaching with his characteristic gentle curiosity. "See this big fella? When I first met him, he was so scared and angry that nobody could get near him. But underneath all that fear was just a horse who wanted someone to understand him." Autumn's grandmother, tears in her eyes, watched as her granddaughter took a tentative step toward the massive stallion. "Can I pet him?" Autumn asked, her voice barely audible. "He'd like that very much," Mav replied. "But first, let's ask him permission." What followed was a masterclass in patience and respect. Mav showed Autumn how to read Inferno's shadow's body language, how to approach with confidence but not aggression, how to let the horse make the choice to accept contact. When Autumn's small hand finally touched the stallion's velvety nose, both the girl and the horse seemed to exhale tension they'd been carrying for months. "He's not scary at all," Autumn whispered in wonder. "No," Mav agreed, "he's not. Fear just makes things look bigger and meaner than they really are." As the afternoon progressed, word spread throughout the facility. Staff members found excuses to pass by the arena, drawn by the sight of a little girl who had been afraid to even look at horses now brushing Inferno's shadow's magnificent coat, while chattering happily about everything from school to her favorite ice cream flavors. Dr. Westmont had long since abandoned her scientific recording, simply watching in amazement as Mav demonstrated that his methods worked not just on horses, but on healing the human heart as well. 1 year after that fateful day at the Prescott Valley Auction House, the Ashworth Equestrian Center hosted its first annual Second Chances exhibition. The event drew visitors from across the globe, all eager to witness what the media had dubbed the Calhoun method in action. The main arena had been transformed for the occasion. Banners bearing the center's new motto, "Partnership over Power," hung from the rafters, and the stands were packed with everyone from curious families to renowned equestrian experts. In the center of it all, Mav stood beside Inferno's shadow, both of them calm and confident as they prepared for their demonstration. The stallion wore no bridle, no saddle, no constraints of any kind. Their partnership had evolved far beyond the need for such things. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cordelia's voice rang out over the crowd. "A year ago, these two souls found each other when the world said it was impossible. Today they're going to show you what's possible when we choose understanding over dominance." In the VIP section, A humbled Augustus Fairweather and Cornelius Blackthorne watched the proceedings. The settlement of their wager had forced them to liquidate substantial assets, but the experience had taught them valuable lessons about humility and respect. They had quietly become donors to the center's program for healing traumatized horses. "I still can't believe we missed it so completely," Fairweather murmured to his partner. "We saw what we expected to see," Blackthorne replied. "A problem to be conquered, instead of a partnership to be built." As Mav began his demonstration, the crowd fell silent. Without any visible cues or commands, Inferno's shadow began a series of movements that showcased his natural grace and intelligence. They moved together like dancers, each understanding the other's intentions through subtle shifts in posture and energy. But the real magic happened when Mav introduced the other horses they'd rehabilitated over the past year. One by one, former problem animals entered the arena, each one now transformed through patience and respect. Wistba, the young mare who had once cowered from human contact, now approached visitors eagerly. Thunder, a gelding who had been aggressive, due to past abuse, gently nuzzled children's hands. Eclipse, a thoroughbred who had refused to be ridden after a racing injury, carried a young rider with obvious pride and care. The demonstration reached its crescendo when little Autumn Sinclair entered the arena. Over the past year, she had become not just a visitor but a student, learning Mav's methods and applying them to her own healing journey. Now she walked confidently among the horses, her earlier fear replaced by genuine love and understanding. A year ago, Mav addressed the crowd, his voice carrying easily across the arena. "A lot of folks thought what we were trying to do was impossible. They said some spirits couldn't be healed, some trust couldn't be rebuilt, some partnerships couldn't be formed." He paused, looking around at the horses who had become his partners, and the people who had found healing alongside them. "But we learned something important here. It's not about being the strongest or the richest or having the fanciest equipment. It's about being patient enough to listen, humble enough to learn, and brave enough to trust." Inferno's shadow moved closer to Mav, pressing his great head against the cowboy's shoulder in a gesture that spoke louder than any words. "Every horse, every person, every soul that's been broken or scared or written off as impossible, they all have the same thing in common. They're just waiting for someone to see past the fear to the potential underneath." The crowd erupted in sustained applause, but Mav barely heard it. He was watching as Dr. Westmont approached a formerly aggressive stallion with the gentle confidence she'd learned from months of observation. He saw Autumn teaching a nervous new visitor how to properly greet a horse. He witnessed Cordelia working alongside a young apprentice who had traveled from Germany to learn these methods. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the arena, Mav realized that the $20 million had been just the beginning. The real treasure wasn't the money. It was the lives that had been transformed, the trust that had been rebuilt, and the proof that impossible was often just another word for not yet understood. Fairweather and Blackthorne approached as the crowd began to disperse. "Mav," Fairweather said quietly, "we owe you an apology, and our thanks." "No apology needed," Mav replied with his characteristic grace. "Sometimes we all need to learn things the hard way." Blackthorne extended his hand. "We'd like to fund a scholarship program for young people who want to learn your methods but can't afford the training." As the three men shook hands in the gathering twilight, Inferno's shadow stood quietly beside them, living proof that the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from the courage to understand. The impossible had become inevitable, and the legend of the untamable stallion had transformed into something far more beautiful. A story of healing, hope, and the unbreakable bonds that form when two souls recognize each other across the darkness and choose to trust again.